my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Good afternoon and welcome to GB News. You're watching Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, radio and online. This show is all about championing common sense, and today we'll be discussing whether we should ignore the ECHR and go forward with the Rwanda migrant scheme. The government admits it was inappropriate for the Crown Prosecution Service to call the Bible offensive, and strikes, and more blooming stripes. But can a deal be reached before Christmas? First, here's a check with the latest news headlines.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. I'm Ray Addison in the GB Newsroom. A man has been charged with facilitating attempted illegal entry into the United Kingdom. It's after 4 people died and 39 were rescued from the English Channel when a migrant boat capsized earlier this week. Kent police say 19-year-old Ibrahima Bar, of no fixed address, has been remanded in custody and will appear at Folkestone Magistrate Court tomorrow. The Chief of the Defence Staff says the military is busy and should not be treated by the government as spare capacity. That's as ministers prepare to deploy over 1,000 troops to cover striking public sector workers. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin says it would be slightly perilous to treat the armed forces as an ultimate backstop for industrial action. Meanwhile, unions are warning that military personnel are not sufficiently trained to cover for ambulance and border staff. Retired Major General Tim Cross disagrees. He told us the Army does have the skills to do the job.
We've got people who are trained, used to driving ambulances in our field medical regiments, Royal Logistic Corps drivers who drive those ambulances. We've got paramedics, and we've got all sorts of skills. We haven't had people, I have to say, involved in border control before, but they're perfectly capable of doing that. And in particular, we've got the ability to bring command and control to some of this stuff, which is what we did during COVID, of course.
Rishi Sunak is accusing union boss Mick Lynch of causing misery to millions by timing rail strikes to hit outings at Christmas. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, the Prime Minister says an increasing number of union members want a deal. However, the RMT has rejected fair offers, he says. Mr Lynch, who is the union's General Secretary, says rail staff continue to receive strong support from the public. While Rishi Sunak's comments come as rail services restart following 48 hours of strike action, passengers are being warned to expect significant disruption, with some trains starting later than usual today. Transport companies say people should check the schedules before beginning their journey. Nurses are threatening to escalate industrial action in the new year if the government fails to break the deadlock over pay by next week. The Royal College of Nursing warns it could impact a greater number of hospitals and scale back support for non-emergency services if further action does go ahead. They're demanding ministers respond within 48 hours of Tuesday's walkout. The former Met Police Commissioner has been accused of trying to minimise the murder of Sarah Everard. The government's outgoing advisor on tackling violence against women told the Sunday Times, Dame Cressida Dick, complained shortly after the murder that the government's initial response was over the top. Dame Cressida has strenuously denied making the comments. A 52-year-old man has been charged with the murders of a mother and her 2 young children in Northamptonshire on Thursday. Police found Anju Asok, an NHS nurse, and her children, aged 6 and 4, with serious injuries at a house in Kettering. They all died a short time later. Post-mortem examinations determined that all three died as a result of asphyxiation. Saju Shelavel from Kettering will appear at Northampton Magistrates Court tomorrow. The UK faces one more day of extremely cold weather before temperatures rise to as high as 14 degrees Celsius on Monday. Parts of the country will see freezing rain, snow and ice, causing difficult travel conditions and road closures. However, milder air coming in from the Atlantic is expected to chase away the cold within 24 hours. Well, in just over an hour's time, the World Cup final between Argentina and France will kick off in Qatar. It could be a record-breaking match. Lionel Messi looks set to become the player with the most appearances in the competition. And if France wins, they'll be the first nation since Brazil in 1962 to retain their titles as world champions. And finally, Eurovision winners Ukraine have picked their entry for next year's song contest. The competition to select a group was broadcast live from a metro station in Kyiv, which also doubled as a bomb shelter. Tavoci won with Heart of Steel and will now be heading to Liverpool in May 2023. The competition is usually held in the winning country. The UK is taking over this year due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. You're watching GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Father Calvin.
Hello and welcome. This is the Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Here's what's coming up this afternoon. Tory MPs have tried to force Rishi Sunak's hand on sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Backbench MPs, including Priti Patel, are backing the bill that would force the Prime Minister to ignore rulings from the ECHR over the deportation of migrants. So will we see flights carrying migrants to Rwanda for processing after all? Then the government has admitted it was inappropriate for the Crown Prosecution Service to argue that parts of the Bible are no longer appropriate in modern society, while trying to convict a Christian preacher of an alleged hate crime. We'll discuss this victory in Christian freedoms. And Rail Union leader Mick Lynch, the Christmas Grinch, says there are no new proposals on the table after talks with the government. He said he would like to see improved proposals on pay and working conditions for its members. But Rishi Sunak says Lynch is causing misery to millions. And of course, you can join in any of our discussions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or by tweeting @gbnews. Deres Volt. Have you ever noticed how the metropolitan liberal elite seem to love wishing everyone a peaceful Eid, a happy Diwali, a happy Hanukkah, but they'll go out of their way to avoid saying Merry Christmas? To me, this seems like old-fashioned racism. Anything foreign is to be celebrated as exotic, but anything British is to be denigrated as imperialist. It's patronising, and it's also counterproductive. With Christianity becoming a minority in the UK, you'd think we'd start to see some of the same positive action provided towards other protected minority groups, but alas, that is not the case. The University of Brighton has issued a statement this week advising lecturers to by the word religious welcoming. Why would the same not be the case for Christianity? A defender of the faith, son to the current defender, and brother and uncle to future supreme governors of the Church of England. I found it quite extraordinary to read their joyful holiday season card. Which holiday? Are they off somewhere? But it doesn't work anyway, because the word holiday is an amalgamation of holy day. The 12 days of Christmas are the holiest days outside of Easter. Happy holy days is still a subtle jollification. I used to think this was all hyperbole. No one's trying to cancel Christmas. No one's trying to get rid of Christmas, I used to say. But now I think that's clearly not the case. I think there is an overt attempt to take Christ out of Christmas. We see it all around us. Frankly, I describe it as quite sinister, if not evil. I don't think it's out of a misguided attempt to avoid offending people either. It's simply anti-Christian, Christophobic, if you like. I think it's a form of religious intolerance that we need to stamp out. Let people celebrate the birth of our Lord and Saviour with joy, and let us welcome everyone into that wonderful celebration. Rejoice, O Adonai. Now, Conservative MP Jonathan Gullis has failed in his attempts to get a bill through the House of Commons that would have obliged the government to ignore the ECHR and start deporting illegal immigrants to Rwanda immediately. Despite being defeated, Gullis's asylum seekers' removal to safe countries bill gained the support of several high-profile Tory MPs, including Priti Patel and John Redwood, revealing an ever-present frustration amongst actual Conservatives at the government's inability to get a grip on the migrant crisis. Joining me now is Jonathan Gullis himself. Thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to join us, Jonathan. Can you give us a brief description of what your private member's bill would have accomplished?
Well, Father, let me start by wishing you a very Merry Christmas and prove that the wokerati hasn't captured me just yet. Although when you go down in London, it does try to infect you, I can assure you. The bill was very simple. It was copying what we did around prisoners' voting rights back in 2010, 2011 under David Davis and the then Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, as well as Labour's Jack Straw, those days when Labour were actually tough on these type of issues. And in essence, the idea is that we should ignore the European Court of Human Rights ruling about stopping and preventing us to offshore illegal migrants to Rwanda and crack on regardless, because at the end of the day, taking back control meant taking back control of our laws and our borders, something that I don't think is contentious. But sadly, of course, the opposition tried to turn this into some sort of, I was called an extremist. I was called a fascistic bill from a Labour Party that were found to be guilty of institutionalised racism towards the Jewish community. So, you know, talk about looking in the mirror.
Had a piece in the Telegraph today saying we need to be more compassionate to illegal immigrants and asylum seekers. Can you just explain why your bill isn't not compassionate?
Well, thank you. It's about stopping people choosing to put themselves in small boats and then crossing icy waters, some of the most busiest waters in the world, and preventing them from risking their lives. And sadly, obviously, where we've seen only this week, people tragically lose their lives. I'm trying to stop smuggling gangs trading in human misery. I'm trying to stop people taking risk. I'm trying to say to people, there's no point coming here because the deterrent, which is you'll be immediately offshore to Rwanda, is going to kick in. And therefore, all that money you're going to pay to come here will simply be wasted. So you might as well come here legally, as do many other people across the world.
We couldn't get a wet to debate you, so I'm going to have to play devil's advocate on this and say, why should people not be allowed to come here? Why should we protect our borders? Why shouldn't we just be welcoming to everybody who wants to come and live in this great country?
Well, as you know, Calvin, actually, one of the best things about Great Britain is that we are a very successful, multicultural, multi-faith country. It's something that I'm very proud to be part of. Here in Stoke-on-Trent, we have, a large Baptist, a large Methodist, a large Muslim community, Kashmiri population as well that's very proactive on wanting, independence for Kashmir. So, and as well as, obviously, the Brexit capital of the United Kingdom, and in a seat which voted 73% leave the European Union. I think this country is welcoming. We've done that with Ukraine, Syria, Hong Kong, Afghanistan. This is something that we've gone above and beyond and always will be able to. But when people are choosing to travel through safe third countries, make their way through mainland Europe when they don't need to, because as Baroness Scotland, a former Labour minister, once said, people should claim asylum in the first safe country they go to. And let's not forget, 100 million people are currently displaced. If the UK just opens up its borders like the Labour Party would insist we do, then that's an awful lot of people coming here, putting further pressure on our housing, further pressure on our school system, further pressure on our healthcare services, and it simply would be unfair to the taxpayers of this great nation.
But Jonathan, are you not concerned about the damage it would cause to Britain's reputation abroad if we were to simply ignore the rulings of the ECHR?
Well, this is where I find it quite amusing because, as I say, we did it with prisoner voting rights for about 7 years. And guess what? Nothing happened to the United Kingdom. We all just carried on as usual. I think France and Germany have a 17 to 18% derogation from European court rulings. In fact, I think there was a report in 2020 that said 45% of all European Court of Human Rights rulings have been ignored by signatories of the convention. So what I'm proposing is that Britain simply is unable to enact the laws it's passed through its parliament, its sovereign parliament, its democratically elected parliament, as was the whole point of taking back control. But if Sir Keir Starmer wants his buddies in Brussels to tell us how to run our country, that's his choice. But I certainly won't be trying to allow that whilst I'm an MP for Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Talk.
OK, I'm done playing devil's advocate. I'll ask you a right-wing question now. Could we not go further? Could we not offshore people and make sure that people, illegal immigrants, are not entering the country at all, not landing on British soil, and should actually be held on a ship or a boat offshore, like they do in Australia? Could we not do that?
I'm not opposed to any of these different ideas. Look, I'm glad, one, we're moving away from hotels. But of course, it's not going to be stomachable to the great British public that we're saying we're going from hotels to holiday camps. The holiday, obviously, as you've explained what it means, doesn't exactly ring true of a good way to send a message to people saying don't bother coming here. I think what we should be doing at the very least is legislating and say if you land in this country illegally, you immediately lose any right to be able to claim asylum and you are immediately deported. Literally picked up from the Dover shores, taken straight to the nearest airport and flown off to Rwanda or other safe third countries. But let's not also forget the fact that a third of these people are Albanians is petrifying, because Lee Anderson's done a great job, and I know he's talked about it with you, Calvin, about the fact you can get a flight from Albania to the UK for £28. If you're an Albanian paying €4,000 or €5,000, that means there's a reason you don't want us to know who you are. You don't want Border Force to see your documentation. And it's here because you want to be here for criminality.
Well, that's a good suggestion. But what about these measures that always get fought in the courts? For example, the Rwanda bill was implemented, the plane was full, and it was emptied pretty much immediately because of human rights lawyers. Can the government not prepare in advance for these human rights lawyers that we know are activists and we know are going to challenge the government every step of the way?
I think, sadly, there's just a legal process that we're going to have to go through, and we have to respect that. And, of course, tomorrow we're expecting a judgment to come out, I believe, around the Rwanda policy from the High Court. And I do hope, obviously, we'll hear the positive news that it is totally within the law. I believe it is. We passed it through Parliament, so therefore it should be well within the law. And obviously it's not for courts to politically interfere in judgments. It's for courts to just make sure that the wording of legislation is good. And I can't see how this won't pass, personally. I suspect we'll then see it appeal to the Supreme Court, which is, a process we'll have to go through, a process I'll respect. But essentially, I think that the same answer will be found, which is there's no reason why we can't do these flights. And once we've got that from the Supreme Court, let's crack on and let's ignore what the European Court of Human Rights tried to do.
Some of us on the outside that Suella Braverman is the only one within government that is actually trying to get these measures implemented. And it was the same with Priti Patel before her. Is Rishi Sunak and the rest of his cabinet trying to protect our borders, or are they fighting against?
I will say this for Rishi, genuinely, because I've had many a conversation with him now in advance of any announcement, seen the detail that he's gone into when it comes to looking at this. I do believe he understands the seriousness of this issue, and I do believe he's willing to go far. I do suspect there are a few in cabinet, Calvin, as well as few on the back benches of the Conservative Party who might be a little bit more nervous than I would like them to be about going as far or as hard as they should be willing to. And as I always say, if we can get people offshored without having to leave the ECHR, happy days. But I personally think it should be an option still on the table. So if worst comes to the worst and we have to go that far in order to make sure we can protect our borders and enforce our laws, then so be it. We shouldn't be afraid to do anything in the name of protecting our country, because at the end of the day, that's what any sovereign nation should be first of all interested in, protecting its borders, protecting its people, and obviously ensuring it flourishes around the world.
Now, Clive, on your knees, Lewis, is known for saying derogatory and quite offensive things. What did you have to say about his comments that housing migrants in disused holiday parks was like putting them in concentration camps?
I think Clive is just so desperate to remain relevant that he'll say anything in order to try and get a bit of notoriety. I'm sure he loves reading about himself in the newspaper or on Twitter. In fact, I know he loves hanging out on Twitter because he thinks that actually represents the United Kingdom's viewpoint. It's a shame that he hasn't actually learnt the reality after that last general election. So I think the best thing to always do with people like Clive, as you say, on your knees, Lewis, is to make sure that we take everything with a pinch of salt, make sure that we understand that his best mate Jezza is no longer leader of the Labour Party, and that he's a bit upset that Keir Starmer won't give him a job. So he's got to find ways to stay relevant elsewhere. And I suspect that we'll keep hearing him ramone on from those backbenches on the opposition side for a little bit longer.
And in summary, your bill didn't make it through. What can the government be doing realistically and practically today to help protect our borders, protect our culture, protect our values and protect our British identity?
Well, it was interesting, isn't it, that the bill didn't pass, but then I've read in the Sunday newspapers that Suella is actually advocating for the very thing I've suggested in Parliament, which is to derogate away from the European Court human rights rulings, and allegedly Rishi Sunak is getting advice on that. So I hope the government, whilst it didn't feel able to whip for a 3-line vote to support it, I hope that they'll actually now go away and then go, well, thanks, Jonathan, for taking the bumps and the scrapes of landing it. We're actually going to do this because we know it makes sense. Let's make sure that it says if you come here illegally, you're immediately unable to apply for asylum. You're immediately offshored, immediately returned if you're Albanian, for example, to Albania. You're an economic migrant. Even Albania's own Prime Minister says that. And let's make sure, most importantly of all, that we prove to the British public we've taken back control, because you say it, Calvin, all the time. If we don't prove that, the Conservative Party will get wiped out the next election.
Absolutely. Well, I'll say it on behalf of people that do want to protect our borders. Thank you, Jonathan Gullis, for trying to take back control. That's Jonathan Gullis, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. Plenty more to come this afternoon. The government says it was inappropriate for the Crown Prosecution Service to argue that parts of the Bible are no longer appropriate in modern society, while trying to convict a Christian preacher of an alleged hate crime. We'll discuss this Christian victory of freedoms very soon. But first, let's have a look at the weather.
Here are the details. Heavy rain will continue in southwest England this evening with blustery winds. A yellow rain warning is in force as there may be some localised flooding. The rain warning also extends to Sussex, where heavy rain and strong winds are expected to continue. It'll be a very mild evening as temperatures climb into double figures. Staying wet and windy across Wales tonight with gusts of 40-mile-per-hour winds around the coast. There'll be some heavy bursts of rain at times, particularly in the south. Temperatures will climb across the Midlands this evening with spells of rain at times. It'll be a rather windy end to the day as well. Now there's a risk of icy roads across parts of northern England this evening, but temperatures will start to climb through the night, allowing the ice to melt away. It'll stay cloudy and windy with spells of rain at times. Snow will clear to the north of Scotland this evening, followed by spells of rain and strong winds. Any snow on the ground will start to melt as mild air pushes in. Cloudy, windy and mild across Northern Ireland this evening as well. There could be a few spells of rain at times too. Tonight, mild air will sweep northwards across the country, pushing away the cold and frosty weather that we've experienced in the last 2 weeks. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. B, I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade on GB News, on TV, online and on your wireless. The government has admitted it was wrong for the Crown Prosecution Service to argue that parts of the Bible were offensive and no longer appropriate for modern society, whilst trying to convict a Christian preacher of an alleged hate crime. Even though the case against the preacher was thrown out, the story attracted international media attention and was seen as the latest example of CPS overreach by pursuing street preachers and an attack on the right of Christians to preach their faith in public. And to give her thoughts on this story, I'm joined by Baroness Kate Hoey, who raised the story in the House of Lords this week. Thank you for joining us this Sunday, Baroness Hoey. First of all, can you let people know what it is you were talking about in the House of Lords in case they didn't see your wonderful clip?
Yes, well, I read it simply in a local paper here in Northern Ireland. It wasn't actually covered much in the UK media at the time, but basically Mr. Dunn was charged with saying things that shouldn't have been said by two people who passed by. The case took a long time to come, and finally, when it was coming to court, the defendants couldn't be traced, so the case was being dropped. But someone within the CPS in the Wessex area actually put out a press release basically saying that there were things that it wasn't a press release, sorry, it had gone to the defence solicitors, which was basically saying that there were certain things now in the Bible that weren't appropriate to be read by preachers in public. Now, I kind of thought, well, this is ridiculous. Is this now government policy? So I asked a question in the Lords on it. And I have to say, one of the most unconditional responses I'd ever had, which I was very pleased with, because Lord Stewart, who speaks for the Attorney General in the House of Lords, made it clear that the Wessex CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, had investigated this and had just realised that actually it was wrong, that it shouldn't have been said. It was not CPS policy to say that the freedom of expression to be able to say and read parts of the Bible in public, that was not illegal. So someone obviously thought that they were being, I don't know, quite clever or whatever, saying this as part of their defence. So I think it's important to raise it. It was important to get that equivocal answer because, the reality is that more and more Christians are being not attacked. That's a sort of very, probably too extreme a word, but they're under a lot of pressure not to do certain things, say certain things. And so I thought it was good to get this answer, and I hope now that the CPS will show a lot more common sense in future.
I would like to think so. I think you're right. There is a growing intolerance. It's not quite at the level of persecution that we see abroad, but it's certainly intolerance in this country towards Christianity. And I think it was quite telling that the CPS deemed at the time that certain parts of the Bible law are not appropriate for modern society. But will there be any consequences to the CPS? It's okay for them to say, well, we shouldn't have said that, but will there be anything to follow up on this?
Well, I probably wouldn't like to be. I would imagine it was somebody who perhaps felt very strongly about it within the Wessex CPS, perhaps at a middle grade or whatever. I would imagine they will now be being sharply reprimanded. And clearly, the important thing is that the Attorney General has said that this is wrong, and it should never have happened, of course. And we have to make sure now that the CPS, I imagine within the CPS, this answer to my question will have been widely circulated amongst people who work there. And, I would hope also it would send a message to people out there who sometimes make these complaints on the spur of the moment, and then perhaps later they decide, they don't really want to go through with it. But of course, the CPS carried on with it, which they should never have done. It goes against all the ECHR rights on freedom of expression and religion. And, I just wonder, would the CPS have said this about bits of the Quran if they were having to be read out in public by someone? So we just have to make sure, as more and more our rights to be able to say what we think, even if people disagree with them, needs to be protected. And so this is one tiny little step, I hope, which will help.
That's the point, though, isn't it? There's two sides to this. So there's the one side that the CPS said that parts of the Bible are inappropriate for modern society, which of course is wrong. But the other side of this is that a man was arrested in the first place just for preaching. A street preacher was charged with a hate crime. Does this demonstrate that the British establishment is becoming more and more anti-Christian?
Well, I think we've seen a number of these kind of situations where the police have moved in quickly and perhaps moved somebody on or taken them away and not necessarily arrested them, but asked them not to go back. Usually when they're preaching something or saying something that maybe doesn't necessarily fit in with the moral views of some other people. But I think it does show that, like in a lot of areas now, I think the police are interfering too much in these kinds of freedom of expression, religious issues, and get back to kind of getting all those people carrying knives off the streets and stopping people having their cars damaged and burglary and all of that, basic policing, which is what we expect from our police, and not this kind of interference in people's personal views and ways of articulating those personal views in public if they wish.
Absolutely with you 100%. Baroness Kate Hoey, thank you so much for fighting the good fight for the faith.
Thank you.
You are with GB News on TV, online and on your wireless. And after the break, RMT leader Mick Lynch has said there are no new proposals on the table after talks with the government. He said he would like to see improved proposals on pay and working conditions for its members, but Rishi Sunak says Lynch is causing misery to millions. Now it's time for a check on those news headlines. Here's Ray.
It's 2:32, here's the latest. A man has been charged with facilitating attempted illegal entry into the United Kingdom. It's after 4 people died and 39 were rescued from the English Channel when a migrant boat capsized earlier this week. Kent police say 19-year-old Ibrahima Bar, of no fixed address, has been remanded in custody and will appear at Folkestone Magistrates Court tomorrow. The Chief of the Defence Staff says the military is busy and should not be treated by the government as spare capacity. That's as ministers prepare to deploy 1,200 troops to cover striking public sector workers. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin says it would be slightly perilous to treat the armed forces as an ultimate backstop for industrial action. Meanwhile, unions are warning that military personnel are not sufficiently trained to cover for ambulance and border staff. Nurses are threatening to escalate industrial action in the new year if the government fails to break the deadlock over pay by next week. The Royal College of Nursing warns it could impact a greater number of hospitals and scale back support for non-emergency services if further action goes ahead. They're demanding ministers respond within 48 hours of Tuesday's walkout. In half an hour's time, the World Cup final between Argentina and France will kick off in Qatar. Could be a record-breaking match. When Lionel Messi takes to the pitch, it will make him the player with the most appearances in the competition. And if France wins, they'll be the first nation since Brazil way back in 1962 to retain their title as world champions. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. You're watching GB News. Don't go anywhere. Father Calvin will be back in just a moment.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade on GB News, on TV, online and on your wireless. Rishi Sunak is accusing union boss Mick Lynch of causing misery to millions by timing rail strikes to hit out against Christmas. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, the Prime Minister says, an increasing number of union members want a deal. However, the RMT has rejected fair offers. And in our GB News People's Poll, a plurality of public still support striking workers. We asked whether you would support the ongoing industrial action. 44% of you said yes, you would support the strikes, whilst 29% opposed them, and 14% say they neither support nor oppose. Members of the Transport Salaried Staffs Association, or TSSA, union at Network Rail have voted to accept a pay deal, but a compromise is yet to be reached with the RMT. Joining me now is lawyer and writer for The Conservative Woman, Carol Kilgore, and the former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards. Thank you both for joining me in the studio today. Peter, I think we'll start with you. The debate about whether Mick Lynch and the RMT has purposefully targeted Christmas is still ongoing. Do you think that's the case? And if so, is it selfish?
I don't think it's selfish at all. I remember Mick Lynch is representing rail workers who've had a real terms pay cut, not for 1 week or 1 month, but over the course of a couple of years. So I completely understand and support their rationale for doing it. What I'd say as a trade unionist, and I've been on strike when I was a newspaper reporter.
Shame.
You strike a balance between whoever you're serving, whether that's passengers or patients or in my case, readers. You care about them because you work them every day, but clearly you time your strike when there'll be disruption. The other thing I'd say is there have been a lot of apocalyptic descriptions about rail strikes over the autumn, and actually I've been able to get from my home to Paddington to come and talk to you on numerous occasions during strikes. We had a service level of about 20%. So I think some of the rhetoric about, Britain grinding to a halt, causing misery and so on, isn't really borne out in reality.
OK, all right. I tend to think the opposite. Carol, what do you think? Is this misery? Is this grinding to a halt? People cannot go to see their loved ones at Christmas.
Well, first of all, Calvin, just set aside that question because the taxpayer has already funded £13.3 billion up to March 22 for this subsidies for the train industry.
Yeah.
And that's not compared to the $5.8 billion that is spent on passenger rail fares. So this is heavily taxpayer funded already. So, I'm not really wanting to debate the fact that whether X person can get from A to B, because that's not really relevant in this context. If anyone needs to get to the hospital, for instance, and can't make that appointment or can't get to see a loved one, the fact that you or I can still manage isn't really relevant. And, this is another raid on taxpayers because it's taxpayer funded. And the whole system needs to be revised and reformed.
OK, well, some of the unions compromised and accepted a deal. Some of them refused to. Does that show you that they're actually looking to be fair and looking after the people they are supposed to be caring for? Or is there a political motive to some of this?
I think there is a political motive. I mean, this reminds me of the Bob Crow, the years when he was leading the strikes for the Tube. And it does seem politicized, unfortunately. I'd like to not think that there's a nefarious intent, but it does seem quite cruel to turn this strike on to the public, which is really basically who's going to be penalized during the Christmas holiday period. When people are trying to see their loved ones, it's just another knife in the, kind of backs of hardworking people, I think.
OK. And Peter, is Rishi Sunak helping things or making things worse with his tone in The Sun today?
I think he's making things worse, and there's a bit of a read across to other strikes. You remember Steve Barclay, we'll talk about later, turned up at a pay negotiation for the NHS strike without a pay offer. Grant Shapps, a former Transport Secretary, called striking rail workers selfish. Now, I think in any workplace where there's a disagreement, I've never found insulting people to be helpful in resolving it. We can either act like adults and say, here's where we agree, here's where we disagree, and work on the second bit, or we can fling insults around. And the other point I would make is that Carol talked about public service, which is actually right. But these people are public servants in the sense of nurses are there to serve patients and train drivers or conductors are there to serve passengers. And they're doing that 365 days a year. So there'll be, or maybe not Christmas Day, so there'll be some disruption.
Sure, but they're not martyrs. They're paid for it.
But they're paid less than they used to be. And in some sectors, they're paid less than their comparison with other countries. So I think if you're doing the same job, serving the public, driving a train, but you get less money in real terms to do that job, but your rent or food is the same or higher, you're worse off. And that's not party political ideological. It's just saying you're poorer because the government, which is the ultimate controller, and the train operating companies won't give you a pay rise that keeps pace with the cost of living.
OK. We heard there that it's not just the rail strikes, it's also the nurses that are striking right now. And of course, they're caring for people, vulnerable people, sick and ill people. Should it ever be legal for someone who is a caregiver to strike?
That's correct. Can I just first respond to Peter's point about the rail strikers? I mean, the other issue that is important to raise is the knock-on effects on the economy, on hospitality and retail, which is basically taking a big beating from this. So it's not just the public. And yes, they are public sector workers, but there are other sectors of the economy which quite frankly, the last 2 years have suffered enormously, and now we'll have a lot of trouble coming back. You know, a lot of cancellations, especially in the city, of corporate events, for instance. And just on the NHS strikes, I'd like to raise the fact that, yes, it is, the nurses have a lot of goodwill, especially with the public. And they do, in my opinion, deserve a pay rise. They have been given a pay rise of 5.5% already, according to the Pay Review Board recommendation, but they're asking for 19%. And the Royal College of Nurses is only giving their own employees 4.5% raise. So there's a bit of hypocrisy there. And then the other point I'd like to make is that the NHS needs severe reform. You have diversity and inclusion officers being paid $77,000 per year. That is just not acceptable. And the clinical staff needs to take priority. So just throwing money at this problem isn't really going to fix the broken NHS.
OK, I'll put that to you, Peter, because the NHS does seem to be wasting a lot of money on these diversity, inclusion and equality officers and such like that, people that are not directly involved in care at all. And I know you're going to say that caregivers need to be paid more because the pay has been reduced in terms compared to inflation, but hasn't all of our money been reduced in terms compared to inflation? Are we all not worse off than we were this time last year and the year before?
OK, well, you wrapped a lot in there. So on diversity and inclusion, I think it's very sensible to have those roles. 77k is quite a high salary, and I suspect many viewers will earn nowhere near that. So that feels quite high. But bear in mind, it was only about a month ago in another public service, the fire brigade, an appalling racism scandal emerged. So I think we can all accept there's more work to be done on inclusion in the public sector, or everything is fine. Clearly, everything is not fine. In terms of pay, you know, I think we've all been reading up a bit on the data. So the Royal College of Nursing, they're the people that have gone on strike this week and may do so again. They've asked for 19.5%. They're very, 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 very unlikely to get that. But even if they did, they would still be worse off had they had inflation matching pay rises over the last 10 years. So even 19.5%, which they're not going to get, they'd still be worse off. And the fact that they're going to end up, I suspect, settling for a smaller sum does reflect some of the economic realities.
Right.
And the other point, very briefly, is about we've got all these vacancies. And again, you take the politics out of it or the ideology. If the state, the NHS, is offering a salary here and there aren't sufficient number of people applying for and getting nurses jobs. We're
going to have to move on to the next debate, but thank you for that. So on to our next debate. The Globe Theatre will change the Shakespeare classic Titus Andronicus to make characters appear more racist. The dialogue will be swapped for the modern vocabulary of race to make dialogue in the play more racially charged and its characters are more obviously prejudiced for contemporary viewers. This is achieved by replacing antiquated ethnic terms like Moor, which have lost the racial force they would have had in the 16th century, with words like black, which are more accessible to a modern audience. Still with me is lawyer and writer for the Conservative woman Carol Kilgore and former editor of Labour List Peter Edwards. Carol, this seems to me to be a bit extreme. They're taking something out of context and trying to cause racial tension.
I agree, Calvin. I mean, firstly, Shakespeare is one of the most top important things of the English language. It's something that English-speaking people have a lot to be proud of. And it really saddens me because this reminds me of the Newspeak. You know, everyone likes to quote 1984 on the right wing, but there's a reason we do that, and that's because this is Newspeak. We're changing the language to make it more dumbed down so that people will understand what was meant by Elizabethan terms. And quite frankly, Elizabethan poetry really should not be touched. It's, I think it's sad that it has come to this.
Yeah, Peter, Shakespeare, the most read author of all time, some of the most read literature after the Bible in the world, helped shape our nation, helped shape our language, our culture. Should we really be dumbing this down? What is it about us today that we cannot access Shakespeare that for hundreds of years prior to us they have been able to do so?
Well, I was glad you used the word access or accessibility because I think that's what this is about now. Yeah. It seems a very strange move. You know, Shakespeare wrote about lots of themes that we find difficult but very relevant, including racism in Titus Andronicus and Othello. But, you know, who are any of us to edit the words of Shakespeare?
Indeed.
Probably the greatest British writer ever. Maybe it would slightly tweak your intro. I don't think it's to make it more racist. It is to make it accessible, because Titus and Andronicus and Othello both cover racism in enormous depth. But it does come back to this point that you should treat audiences as intelligent. If they're under 18, it's a different matter, because, you know, kids can't get everything from 400 years ago if you're 11.
Why?
I think, Shakespeare plays are often shortened, for example, Romeo and Juliet for kids' audiences. I think if you've got a group of 11-year-olds, they might not want to sit for 3 or 4 hours. And I say that as someone that studied English at A-level and at university and to a higher degree. So I want to see more people reading and watching Shakespeare. There's nothing wrong with a bit of editing for space, but I think changing the words is really misguided.
Yeah, I'm going to bring it back to you, Carol, because I happen to think this is cultural vandalism. But we see the same thing in the church. The King James Bible is, again, one of the most read pieces of English literature that ever has been. It helped shape our culture and our language. But people say, oh, kids today, they can't understand it. It's not accessible. And again, we dumb down to the lowest common denominator. Now, does that mean that this generation is, well, more stupid than previous generations? Or does it mean that we as adults patronise younger people more so now than previously?
I'd like to think that it's the latter, Calvin. I'd like to think that we don't have to dumb down all of what we're educating children for. And in the US, there are even calls to not teach Shakespeare in schools. And I think that's a travesty. I mean, I think that children can rise to the level of the education that you give them, and you can challenge them. And you know, particularly in terms of politicization of works of art. That's a very dangerous, slippery slope. And you'll see that can lead to things like, if we're going to have to change the past, why not initiate reparations? You know, race reparations.
Let's not go on to that one.
It's a Pandora's box.
It is. Let's leave that one in its box. That was lawyer and writer for the Conservative woman, Carol Kilgore, and the former editor of Labourist, Peter Edwards. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio today. Now, it's the final of the World Cup. The football is still on, apparently, with Argentina and France set for a showdown in around 15 minutes. It'll be a closely fought fixture, with both sides within reach of football glory as both teams prepare for the final game. Paul Hawkins reflects on the first World Cup to be held in the Middle East.
We've swapped the souk for the sands of Qatar. This is the Khor Al Adaid area, where the inland sea meets the desert. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, there is no comparable lagoonal system like this anywhere else in the world. As the sun sets on another World Cup, it's time to take stock. It started with armbands and rainbow hats.
At the end of the day, it gave us a platform to talk about LGBT rights and inclusion and diversity, and why these things are important to us in Wales and in the other progressive nations that are here.
The backdrop to England v Iran was full of politics, highlighting racial inequality on the field as well as women's rights in Iran. The fans coming together on both issues.
I think all the people around the world want the best for humanity, and Iran is part of that. So hopefully things will get better.
This was a dry country, but there was alcohol if you wanted it. However, no booze, no problem. This World Cup was different. It was family friendly and it was safer. A kind of vast social experiment where football and alcohol, which are inextricably linked, are suddenly pulled apart.
We are live on Danish television.
Would the media be allowed to freely report?
You invited the whole world to come here. Why can't we film? It's a public place.
Aside from this initial misunderstanding between officials and a Danish TV crew, for which the Qataris apologised, the answer was yes. Wales' first World Cup for 64 years ended in disappointment, but many of the Red Wall were simply happy to be here. Look at that. There you go. Look at that. There you go. It's like the Welsh David Brent. England's campaign, on the other hand, ended in penalty heartbreak again. Just one kick away from reaching another semi-final. Perhaps. On the night, England were the better side. They just didn't win the key moments.
A little bit disappointed, but it's still, after that game, there's a lot of positives to take from it. So we're still positive about the future, and only 18 months to the Euros as well to look forward to.
This was a World Cup for the underdogs. Japan beating Germany, who failed to reach the knockout stages. Morocco beating Portugal, Spain and Belgium, who also failed to get out of their group. France losing to Tunisia, Saudi Arabia beating Argentina, one of the greatest World Cup shocks ever. And yet here we are, despite all of that. Argentina v France in the final. The little magician versus the young pretender. Messi versus Mbappe. Both play for the same club, but the Frenchman, who's only 23 years old, is already a World Cup winner. For Messi, at 35, this is his last chance to win the only trophy that's eluded him. Some say he can only be considered alongside Maradona when he wins football's greatest prize. Paul Hawkins, GB News.
Paul joins me from Doha now to look ahead to tonight's big final. Good afternoon, Paul. What's it looking like out there?
Yeah, morning, afternoon, I should even say to you, Calvin. Listen, we're just 5 minutes away. In fact, I'm just looking over my shoulder at the monitor in the Lusail Stadium, which is just north of Doha. The teams are coming out onto the pitch now, and frankly, it looks like a sea of Argentina fans. About 5,000 French fans in the Lusail Stadium, and the rest is virtually Argentina. They've almost turned Doha into Buenos Aires this afternoon. The question is, will Lionel Messi win that one trophy that has eluded him? Will he cement his status as one of the greats? Because some people say you can't put Messi alongside Pelé and Maradona until you win the World Cup. And the World Cup is where you get those iconic moments that live on in football history. Think of Pelé in the 1970 World Cup final, Maradona in '86, etc. So some people say until he wins that trophy, then you can't really put him alongside the greats. Will Argentina win? Listen, a lot of their team play is based around Messi, stop Argentina, but they do have some decent players, and they've shown a togetherness in this World Cup that has taken them further than the sum of their parts. France, on paper, have the better team. It's not just about Kylian Mbappe, who, if France win the World Cup, will become the youngest player since Pelé in '62 to win 2 World Cups. They do also have other players, Antoine Griezmann, Olivier Giroud. They've got the players that can hurt Argentina. It's going to be a really tight affair. The question is, when we look back at this World Cup, we can say it's been one for the fans because it's been in one of the smallest countries in the world, so people have been able to see multiple games over the course of a very short time. This is the shortest World Cup since 1978. We can call this a fans' World Cup, but will it be Messi's World Cup? That's what we're waiting to find out.
That was GB News reporter Paul Hawkins live in Doha for us. You are watching Calvin's Common Sense Crusade with me, Calvin Robinson. I'll be back after this break.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
I think I've seen probably quite enough of Matt Hancock to last me a lifetime.
I'll also be getting to know you better, travelling to find out what you think about the politicians who are fighting for your vote.
They've got to get this country back on track.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. only on GB News, on TV, radio and online.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hello and welcome back. This is Calvin's Common Sense Crusade on your TV, radio and online. And this hour we'll be discussing Harry's claims that he and Meghan were better at the job than Charles, Kate and William. Brighton University urges staff not to say Christmas because it's too Christian-centric. And Cambridge Dictionary updates the definition of woman. But first, let's get your latest news headlines with Ray.
Good afternoon, it's 3:01. Here's the latest. A man has been charged with facilitating attempted illegal entry into the United Kingdom. It's after 4 people died and 39 were rescued from the English Channel when a migrant boat capsized earlier this week. Kent police say 19-year-old Ibrahima Bar, of no fixed address, has been remanded in custody and will appear at Folkestone Magistrate Court tomorrow. A cabinet minister says it's not fair that military personnel are having to cover for public sector workers on strike over the festive period. Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Oliver Dowden, urged unions to call off the industrial action, warning that significant pay rises would end up making everyone poorer. More than 1,000 troops are expected to cover striking workers, such as paramedics and border force officials. Meanwhile, the Chief of the Defence Staff says the military is busy and should not be treated by the government as spare capacity. The Prime Minister is accusing union boss Mick Lynch of causing misery to millions by timing rail strikes to hit outings over Christmas. Writing in The Sun on Sunday, Rishi Sunak says an increasing number of union members want a deal. However, the RMT has rejected fair offers, he says. Mr Lynch, who is the union's General Secretary, says rail staff continue to receive strong support from the public. Nurses are threatening to escalate industrial action in the new year if the government fails to break the deadlock over pay by next week. The Royal College of Nursing warns it could impact a greater number of hospitals and scale back support for non-emergency services. That's if further action goes ahead. They're demanding ministers respond within 48 hours of Tuesday's walkout. Police searching a property in Birmingham say they've found what is believed to be the remains of a child. West Midlands Police have been searching the garden of a house in Handsworth following information about a possible burial of human remains. A post-mortem examination will be carried out to establish the cause of death. A 52-year-old man has been charged with the murders of a mother and her 2 young children in Northamptonshire on Thursday. Police found Anju Ashok, an NHS nurse, and her children aged 6 and 4 with serious injuries in a house in Kettering. They all died a short time later. Post-mortem examinations determined all 3 died as a result of asphyxiation. Saju Shelavel from Kettering will appear at Northampton Magistrates Court tomorrow. The former Met Police Commissioner has been accused of trying to minimise the murder of Sarah Everard. The government's outgoing advisor on tackling violence against women told the Sunday Times that Dame Cressida Dick complained shortly after the murder that the government's initial response was over the top. Dame Cressida has strenuously denied making the comment. The founder of The Big Issue magazine says the government needs to get off its rear in tackling homelessness in the UK. Lord Bird, who launched the magazine in 1991, warns the threat of homelessness for families is worse than it's ever been. He says there are 1 million people who face slipping into poverty and homelessness due to not being able to pay their rent or mortgage. He's urging the government to move away from short-term solutions. And Eurovision winners Ukraine have picked their entry for next year's song contest. The competition to select a group was broadcast live from a metro station in Kyiv, which also doubles as a bomb shelter. Tvorchi won with Heart of Steel and will now be heading to Liverpool in May 2023. The competition, usually held in the winning country, will be held in the UK instead due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Calvin.
Hello and welcome. This is the Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Here's what's coming up this afternoon. The Duke of Sussex has described how terrifying it was to have his brother, the Prince of Wales, shout and scream at him at the Sandringham summit in front of the Queen during the Megxit crisis. We will discuss Brighton University, which urges staff not to say Christmas because it's too Christian-centric, and instead calls for the winter closure period. Staff at the university were sent a 9-page document on phrases to avoid. Is this the latest woke attack on Christianity? The Cambridge Dictionary has updated its definition of woman to include anyone who identifies as female, stating an adult human female being is a woman and can also be an adult who lives and identifies as female, though they may have been said to have different sex at birth. And of course, you can join in on any of our discussions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or by tweeting @gbnews. Deus Vult. Now, talking about cancellations, every once in a while you come across a story that proves beyond doubt that cancel culture has been normalised in our society. The story of my next guest is an example of that. Joining me in the studio is my good friend Winston Marshall, co-founder of the band Mumford & Sons and more recently host of the excellent Spectator podcast Marshall Matters. Winston, give us the rundown, the brief synopsis. What happened to you and why?
First of all, Father Calvin, thank you so much for having me on your show and happy Christmas. Well, this is a while ago now, it's 18 months ago, so life has moved on, but I was, as you said, a co-founding member and a member of the band Mumford & Sons for 14 years. And in 2021, I tweeted about a book by Andy No, who I believe has been on GB News a few times, which documents the far-left extremism in the United States through 2020. And it somehow turned into a huge story. I was forced to apologise, did apologise, but also thought, well, actually, maybe I didn't know the whole story here, looked into it. I thought I had been right. Actually, yes, it was a problem that 19 people had been killed in the first 14 days of the BLM riots. It was a problem, mostly black lives, I should say. There was a problem that many businesses were destroyed. So I stood by my original comment and decided the only way forward was for me to leave the band. So that was that story. But I said, that's 18 months ago, and since been making music with new people and have my new show at The Spectator, Marshall Matters.
Very good. I won't delve too much on the incident itself, but I want to talk around it, because you saw this coming, didn't you? We had conversations long before this. You talk about how woke the music industry is and how concerned you are that there's no plurality of views and opinions there.
Absolutely. So I would say that the music industry and the creative industries more broadly are hold a progressive groupthink. And I think it's absolutely normal that any community would have groupthink of some sort. If it's even GB News, I'm sure, has its own groupthink. You've riled against the BBC for having its own groupthink. If you were in the city, they would presumably be more free market. And it so happens that in the creative industries, and this is linked to personality types, people are more progressive, I'd say. Not liberal in the old sense, but progressive. Yeah. And so this became a problem. So, for example, BLM and you and I were talking at the time. For those of us who had read the literature on Black Lives Matter, say, for example, the book by Patrice Carton-Cullis, we knew that this organisation was explicitly Marxist. If you looked even a cursory glance into BLM, you could see that this was anti-family, anti-Christian, and by anti-Christian, I mean Marxism is an anti-Christian doctrine. Yeah. And so by being explicitly Marxist, we could see that it was anti-Christian. So it was definitely at ends with my own personal beliefs, that organisation. Now, most people hadn't read the literature on BLM, and it was more a feeling and a mood that was supported without much of a deep dive, although now we've seen with how they spent their money, 90 million, 30 million on Wall Street, and this is Black Lives Matter, a bunch on their own property portfolios, a bunch on trans communities, nothing for Black lives, of course. So we could have seen this a mile off, but certainly it was troubling to me in advance, and I could feel it from a mile off, even whilst I was still in the band, that a lot of these ideas that had contaminated creative industries were at ends, and many of them were bad ideas. They were at ends with my own Christian beliefs. Yeah.
But the music industry used to be full of rock stars. It used to be full of people that were anti-establishment, would fight against the system, in inverted commas. It seems to me that they're on the side of this system now. They're on the side of the establishment, and they're not standing up for people, normal, everyday folk. But that must be in a conflict with you if you say you're a man of the faith, the Christian faith. How did your faith help you or hinder you in the creative industry?
Well, I've already explained how it was a hindrance in that by believing things, let's say, like that all humans are created equal, that all of us are fallible, that ran me into trouble, and because I had brought to light some of the downsides of the BLM movement, you know, I would say that it's a pretty cutthroat industry, and so I look back at my own time, and sometimes perhaps I wasn't as Christian as I should have been. So I'm not sort of pretending that I'm in any way.
But that's the point of being Christian, isn't it? We're all sinners, and none of us are perfect, or none of us are holy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how did it help you throughout your cancellation? Did your faith give you any hope?
I mean, I was in constant dialogue with him through that period, and in and out of church. It was a very difficult decision for me to quit the band, and it was handing it to him, because you know, take in mind that just my whole adult life I'd been with them, and I didn't know life outside of it. So it was certainly a difficult decision, but it was in faith in him, but also in the pursuit of truth. And so what really bothered my conscience was that I had apologised for something, and so I was part of the lie. And that was not something that I could stand by, and that was really, really bothered me. Had I not been made to make that apology, it's unlikely I would have had to leave the band, I think, for conscious reasons. Where my faith has helped me is that I've handed it over to him, and I have faith in him. But in the pursuit of truth, my life will be more meaningful, I guess, more fulfilled.
Absolutely, and he is the way, the truth, and the life. Thank you very much for your time today, Winston Marshall. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having.
Now, coming up, we have some emails from you guys on the topics we've been talking about today. Let's have a look at what you've been sending in. On the CPS calling parts of the Bible offensive, Jim says, Calvin, now they're trying to censor the Holy Bible. It's funny how the Quran isn't up for censorship. It is quite funny that, isn't it, Jim? There are certain religions that are easily censorable and certain others that they will not touch with a 10-foot yardstick. Mike goes on to say, so reassuring and refreshing to see someone like you standing up for good sense and Christian values. You really are one of God's people here on earth. Bless you, Calvin. Keep up the good work. Don't praise me, Mike. I appreciate it, Mike, but don't praise me. This is all about him and his work, and we do what we can to support that. On people trying to cancel Christmas, Bob says, I think the Tories cancelled Christmas in 2021. Well, Christmas has been cancelled several times over the last few years. You're absolutely right. They'll keep trying, but we have to keep fighting back and say, no, you cannot cancel our religious ceremony. We will still see our family. We'll still have our roast turkey, and we'll still praise the Lord. Dan says, of course the left is trying to cancel Christmas. The left is on a mission to destroy Christianity because it pushes back so strongly on communism. Karl Marx expressly said he wanted the destruction of religion and the destruction of the family. That goes exactly to what Winston Marshall was just saying, that Marxism is fundamentally anti-Christian and anti-British, actually. It will destroy our way of life, and we have to fight against that too. King Charles has extended an olive branch to Harry and Meghan, as several sources close to the royal family have revealed that the Sussexes will be welcome at the King's coronation in May, should they wish to attend. Despite growing calls for the pair to be stripped of their royal titles after they heavily criticised the firm in the Netflix docuseries, the King and the rest of the royal family are said to want to retain the dignity of silence and not have ongoing battles with the couple of who gets the last word. And to give his word on this is royal commentator Rafe Hadel-Mancu. Rafe, my old debating buddy, good to have you on here today.
A pleasure.
What a mess this whole situation has been. I think the royal family are probably right to keep their dignity of silence, aren't they?
I think that's very important. By rising above it in this way, and also by carrying on their duty of service, I think the contrast speaks volumes.
Yes.
It makes the Sussexes look like they're small-minded, petty and bitter. But what we also know now is that they seem to be appalled that they didn't get the similar apology that Lady Hussey gave to Ngozi Fulani. So as a precondition for actually attending the coronation, they're now demanding an apology from the King and the Prince of Wales, which I think is...
Apology for what?
I think it's quite outrageous. And what they're doing, essentially, is trying to deflect attention away from the coronation onto themselves, you know? On a spiritual and temporal level, both ceremonially and constitutionally, the coronation is our most important national event, a great time for national unity, national celebration. We're the only country in Europe to have a Christian coronation service where the King will be anointed and crowned. It's a sacrament as much as taking holy orders. Absolutely. And it's a great time for the nation to come together. And for them to try to deflect attention away from that and onto themselves, I think is the most narcissistic and selfish act imaginable.
So we know, you mentioned there that Harry and Meghan are asking for an apology. This was a Sunday Times report, so we don't know if that's true or not. But what would they be asking for an apology for?
Well, you might very well ask that. For the way in which they've been treated, for the way in which they believe allegedly that William bullied them out. I mean, it's a nonsensical thing. If anything, they should be the ones on bended knee, seeking forgiveness, not only from the monarchy, but from the entire British nation for stating that Britain is institutionally racist and that the Brexit vote was founded upon racism. Wholly untrue. Well, everything that they've done recently has been to alienate Britain in order to capture the American market. I think they've realised that Britain is now a no-go zone for them. Yeah. But to sell out your country, you know, I'm just glad that the Queen isn't here to see this, to see her own grandson betray her legacy, betray his family, and traduce the institution that gave him and his wife everything, and upon which everything that they have all of their wealth continues to rest. And again, to do this to his father at a time when we're in the sensitive period of transition, the succession isn't complete yet. The whole point of this period is to try to create a positive atmosphere for the coronation, and they're doing everything they can to block that.
Well, Rafe, what was your most outlandish moment from that awful docu-series? One that stood out for me most recently in the last set of episodes was when Beyonce texts Meghan, and Harry's like, oh, he's like, he had a literal gasp. I don't know if it was acting or not, but the fact that they got so excited over a celebrity.
Well, and how convenient that the text came through just as the cameras were rolling and they were side by side by their laptops. I mean, it's quite remarkable to see the man. I mean, this is not a documentary. It's either a mockumentary or it's a propaganda project, quite clearly, to advance a certain narrative. I mean, for me, it was just the galling lack of balance. All these allegations that the palace were briefing against Meghan and Harry, and yet no mention was made of the fact that the palace actually suppressed publication of the damaging report into Meghan's alleged bullying in order to save her reputation. Those of us who are actually on the inside in this know how well the royal family were trying to improve Meghan's lot by suppressing such stories. Of course, none of that suits the narrative, and so that was carefully cut out of this.
No, and of course there's the curtsy as well, the dishonourable taking the mickey out of the late Queen, but also, as you said, taking the mickey out of the institution of the monarchy and the country at the same time. And what struck me when I was watching that was Harry he was cringing, he was physically repulsed, but the moment she sits back up, he's like, oh yes, dear, what do you think that means?
I mean, I think that's appalling. Also, an appalling thing to do in reference to the Queen. But of course, we've known for a long time that Meghan's a delusional drama queen. The sad thing here was seeing how Prince Harry has gone so far down. You could see him cringing there, but grinning and bearing it. That was the most painful thing of all. Yeah, and for the longest time, I blamed her. But I think actually he's just as much to blame, if not more so, than her in all of this. Do you agree? Yes, well, I said the other day that he's the John Lennon and she's the Yoko Ono of the royal family.
Well said. Rafe, thank you very much. That's royal commentator Rafe Hadel-Mancu. Thank you for your time today. Plenty more to come this afternoon on my Common Sense Crusade. Staff at a British university are urging staff not to say Christmas because it's too Christian-centric. Is this the latest woke attack on Christianity?
Rain clouds are spreading northwards as milder air returns across the country. Here are the details. Heavy rain will continue in southwest England this evening with blustery winds. A yellow rain warning is in force as there may be some localised flooding. The rain warning also extends to Sussex, where heavy rain and strong winds are expected to continue. It'll be a very mild evening as temperatures climb into double figures. Staying wet and windy across Wales tonight with gusts of 40-mile-per-hour winds around the coasts. There'll be some heavy bursts of rain at times, particularly in the south. Temperatures will climb across the Midlands this evening with spells of rain at times. It'll be a rather windy end to the day as well. Now there's a risk of icy roads across parts of northern England this evening, but temperatures will start to climb through the night, allowing the ice to melt away. It'll stay cloudy and windy with spells of rain at times. Snow will clear to the north of Scotland this evening, followed by spells of rain and strong winds. Any snow on the ground will start to melt as mild air pushes in. Cloudy, windy and mild across Northern Ireland this evening as well. There could be a few spells of rain at times too. Tonight, mild air will sweep northwards across the country, pushing away the cold and frosty weather that we've experienced in the last 2 weeks. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late-night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons? I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade on GB News, on TV, online and on your wireless. The University of Brighton has issued a 9-page inclusive language document in which it urges staff to avoid using the word Christmas because it's seen as too Christian-centric, and instead advises them to call it the winter closure period. The document also advises staff to avoid other supposedly Christian-centric language like, "What is your Christian name?" and, rather ironically, generalizations about people based on their age, such as millennial snowflakes. And to give his thoughts on this story is my brother from another mother, the uncancelable Darren Grimes. Darren, good to see you. How are you?
Good to be with you, Calvin. I'm all the better for seeing you.
What is this woke nonsense all about, honestly? Christian universities trying to cancel the word Christian.
I think upon hearing this, Calvin, it's probably quite easy for some viewers to say, well, this all sounds somewhat inconsequential, right? Who ultimately cares what Brighton University's Marxists and vegans get up to down there in the South Coast? But I think actually in saying that the word Christmas ought to be dismissed as being too Christian-centric, I dare say many agree with me, actually, when I said online that if you don't like the use of the word Christmas, you're welcome, to take your culture war and take it elsewhere, frankly, because I dare say I'm not alone among viewers in actually imagining the howls and the shrieks, Calvin, that would come from the political commentariat here in Britain if someone dared suggest that we ought to ban a word for being too Islam-centric or too Hindu-centric. But you may, as I say, be minded to conclude that, this is an irrelevance ultimately, and poor old Grimesy and collared Calvin maybe need to find another bone of contention. But actually, I think you and I, Calvin, need to be making the case about why this really does matter, why reducing Christmas to a winter closure period ought to actually matter to everybody. Look at it like this. Whether you like it or not in Britain, whether you attend churches like your own, Calvin, or whether or not you only attend church at maybe Christmas or Easter or for a baptism or indeed for a funeral, Christianity actually remains at the bedrock, at the foundation upon which much of our nation, most of our nation, is actually built, right? Christianity is our cultural inheritance. It's what that cultural inheritance people fought and died for. And I think it's one absolutely worth protecting. If you consider how many of the laws of our land, how many have not been plucked from the thin air spouted by a politician, Calvin, but have actually stemmed by Judeo-Christian beliefs on what's right, what's wrong, what's good, or what's bad. And the established church, and you and I have got a fair few things to say about the established church in this country, despite all it does to try and tarnish its rich inheritance, everything about it, and our history, our arts, our culture, they're all steeped in Christianity. So, Calvin, I'm afraid I do take this seriously, and I'm afraid I do think it needs to be rejected, because what we're at risk of losing here is way more important than a couple of unruly Marxists in Brighton, I think, should be allowed to get away with.
Absolutely. You mentioned that our laws were founded in Christianity, but let's not forget our universities were founded in Christianity. It's the Christian church that started our universities and many of our schools. But Christianity is now a minority religion in this country. So surely Christianity should be given the same protection that other protected minority groups are.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, isn't it? You know, maybe we'll get the Equality Act changed and we'll put Christians in there, Calvin. Maybe that's one way of going about it. It seems to be the go-to for all identity politics these days. But I think it goes much further beyond anything like that. I mean, take the King's speech, right? Whilst we're all sat around stuffing our face with turkey and God knows what else. Imagine if we dismissed the King's speech on the grounds that the King is a Christian, right? How many of us tuned in to hear from Her Majesty the Queen, late and great that she was, someone whose faith actually guided and moulded her into being the selfless and dedicated monarch that we all broke our hearts at the loss of and were so lucky to actually have in this country. I mean, if I consider my own journey, I found my faith, Calvin, in my fight against the Electoral Commission, right? It healed a deep-rooted feeling of loneliness in what was a fight that I had to ultimately fight on my own. And again, actually, upon the death of my grandfather, seeking solace in church at that moment, a moment of grief. Imagine, Calvin, and I want your viewers to imagine that as well. Imagine if the church was no longer there. Imagine if hubs of charity, hubs of community, if meeting halls, if places of beautiful music from our past were no longer able to be cherished and housed in these beautiful buildings that represent so much. Imagine saying goodbye to something so fundamental to who we are as a nation for fear of not being quote unquote inclusive. I mean, how many people who pop along to church, Calvin, and actually utilize it even as they say a spiritual experience, right? Who receive comfort in a silence that's almost otherworldly, maybe. Where do you think in our modern age, with its on-demand apps, right, and its tech, where do you think we're going to be able to find and seek that kind of comfort and solace when Christ and church has been removed from the picture?
Well, you're raising
That's what I want people to ask.
Good questions that I don't think we have an answer to, and I don't think the university does either. But as always, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for coming on today. That was broadcaster Darren Grimes. You are with GB News on TV, on your wireless and online. And after the break, the Cambridge Dictionary has updated its definition of woman to include anyone who identifies as female, stating an adult female human being is a woman and can also be an adult who lives and identifies as female, though they may have been said to have a different sex at birth. Now it's time for a check on those news headlines.
Fast approaching 3:32, I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. A man has been charged with facilitating attempted illegal entry into the UK. It's after 4 people died and 39 were rescued from the English Channel when a migrant boat capsized earlier this week. Kent police say 19-year-old Ibrahima Bar, of no fixed address, has been remanded in custody and will appear at Folkestone Magistrates Court tomorrow. The Cabinet Minister says it's not fair that military personnel are having to cover for public sector workers on strike over the festive period. Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Oliver Dowden, urged unions to call off the industrial action, warning that significant pay rises would end up making everyone poorer. More than 1,000 troops are expected to cover striking workers, such as paramedics and border force officials. Police searching a property in Birmingham say they've found what is believed to be the remains of a child. West Midlands Police have been searching the garden of a house in Handsworth following information about a possible burial of human remains. A post-mortem examination will be carried out to establish the cause of death. The founder of The Big Issue magazine says the government needs to get off its rear in tackling homelessness in the UK. Lord Bird, who launched the magazine in 1991, warns the threat of homelessness for families is worse than it's ever been. He says there are 1 million people who face slipping into poverty and homelessness due to not being able to pay their rent or mortgage. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. You're watching GB News. Calvin will be back in just a moment.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison? I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents. Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. B, I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other pay-per-review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade on GB News, on TV, online and on your wireless. Sir Keir Starmer has pledged to abolish the House of Lords in his first term if he's elected Prime Minister. The proposal was part of Gordon Brown's commission on the UK's future, commissioned by Labour 2 years ago. I spoke with historian and broadcaster Professor Dr. David Starkey about Labour's plans for our weekly segment. David, how important a part is the House of Lords in our constitution, and is that the reason that Labour want to abolish it?
The House of Lords can be seen simply as a dignified part, in other words, a performance, as opposed to the efficient part, which is the House of Commons. But actually, of course, the House of Lords is Parliament. This is why the state opening of Parliament takes place in the House of Lords, presided over by the King, now, of course, was the Queen, and who never, of course, takes part in their deliberations, but is the animating force. All statutes are actually issued in the name of the King with the advice and consent of the Lord Spiritual and Temporal. Spiritual, they're your lot. They are the bishops. The Lords Temporal are the peers, and Commons in this present Parliament assembled that. Now, that has been going on, Calvin, in exactly that same form since the 14th century. We have modified it a little bit. We have introduced different notions of franchise, but the fundamental idea of Parliament is this notion of self-government, because the great formula, and it's announced again as early as the 1300s by the judges, is everybody is bound by what is decided in Parliament, because everybody is there represented either in person, they're the Lords, or by their representatives, they're the Commons. Now, that idea, that historical grounding of our Constitution, is, of course, what a very minor, temporary, here today, gone tomorrow politician like the Lord Speaker, Lord McFall, simply doesn't understand. And the great problem is most constitutions last only 20 years. Ours has lasted pushing 600.
Well, let's take a look at Lord McFall's comments. He said the House of Lords needs to keep up with the times. If it doesn't, it will decline, and that's bad for our politics and bad for our democracy. He recommended making the chamber smaller, more inclusive, and more representative of all parts of the United Kingdom. Now, what do you make of that?
I think there's a very solid case for making it very much smaller. But the real question, Calvin, is to ask why the Lords is such a mess. And the reason why the Lords is such a mess is Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. It is the chaos of constitutional reforms of New Labour, which were brought in off the hoof with no serious consideration as to their consequences, and the disasters of which we are reaping now. A House of Lords of a House of Cronies. That's what they actually created. They claimed to be reforming. They were corrupting.
And why shouldn't we have an elected second chamber? What's the benefit of valuing our inheritance?
An essential part of a constitution is balance. You require old and new. You also need to recognize that the old should shape the new, that it's a kind of soil, it's a kind of humus from which novelty should arise. You don't go out, again, Disraeli described, the greatest conservative politician of the 19th century, the founder of the modern Conservative Party. He puts it beautifully. He says, Britain is a progressive country. There will always be change. There should be change. The question is how you change. And he says what you should do is change should modify what you've got. You shouldn't be going outside and reaching for alien principles. I mean, and New Labour, of course, exemplifies this completely. You go outside and borrow a wholly foreign concept like the separation of powers. There's never been a separation of powers in Britain. It is a complete myth. You go outside and reach for a wholly foreign notion like a Supreme Court. And England, Britain rejected that idea. Common law is firmly and properly under the will of the people as expressed in Parliament, which is why you have this extraordinary tension now between popular opinion and the legal system. What's very interesting if I bothered to read the full report, and if you get to the end of it, even they are worried about it. What they say is we need to establish its legitimacy. Do you know what they say? We might even need to talk to the people about it. But what's very striking is they don't talk about talking to the people through the legitimate channels of Parliament. They want citizens' juries. Well, we know why they want citizens' juries. They would fix who was on the citizens' jury. But even they recognize the need for legitimacy. And the fact you've done things in one way is the reason for legitimacy.
So obviously America has a separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary and the legislative. We do not, since our political and legal authority in the UK comes from the Crown, who was given authority by God.
Calvin. I do hope your history is better than, so I do hope your theology is better than your history. we have never been ruled by an absolute monarch deriving his or her power solely from God. I mean, the English Constitution is this weird mixture of elegant lies, elegant untruths, and real truths. And when you say the monarch rules by grace of God, the DG, which appears on the coinage, yes, that is the theory. The practice is that the powers of the monarch are wholly limited and have been from a very early period. The best way of understanding Britain is that it's a royal republic. We've been a royal republic since the very latest, the 16th century, I would argue earlier on. And what gives the monarchy its force is the consent of the people, however you define it, given through Parliament. No monarch who could not command Parliament could ever survive. This is where our power comes from. But in other words, the power of the reason there's no separation of powers, the reason that there is the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative, in a sense, fused into one, is because Parliament doesn't represent the will of God. It represents the will of the collective of the English/British people. That's where its power comes from. Now, where does God fit in? Where does the established church fit in? I think it fits in, Calvin. And do you know what? I'm now going to say, I used to argue in my days when I was a standard bearer for the National Secular Society on the moral maze, campaigning Starkey. It is a disgrace that bishops sit in the House of Lords. I would say the only, as it were, clerical legislators in any other assembly are in Iran. You know, the Ayatollah of Canterbury. And I say this is utterly disgraceful. I would now disagree, and I would rather agree with you that we should keep them. Why? Not because I think that they represent the voice of God. I think they represent the need for ceremony. They need the idea that affairs of state should be conducted with decency, with dignity, with tradition. Exactly what we saw with the Queen's funeral, what I hope we will see with the King's coronation. But you know, this isn't particularly Christian. Remember, the title of the Pope, he's got two titles. One is very Christian, Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. But the other is Roman. It's Latin. It's imperial. Pontifex Maximus, high priest, because Rome, as the Church of England does, conducted itself through formal religious ceremonies which express the heart of the state. So can we agree on a compromise?
It seems to me you're suggesting we should hold on to having bishops in the second chamber for the purposes of history, inheritance, tradition. But surely there's another dimension there. Surely there's the conscience of the country. Surely there's moral direction. And all of that comes from the Christian faith. Is that not important too?
Well, it would be if they showed any sign of doing it.
Touche.
Touche. Of course it would be. But remember, the Church of England is now taken over by New Labour. Welby is interested in new. He's totally indifferent to tradition. I am hoping next year to address a clerical conference on the importance of an idea of national religion. The Church of England has completely abandoned any notion of being a genuine national church. If the church wants to keep up, look, I'm gay. I can well understand why gay members of the church are affronted at not being able to marry in church. But sorry, there is 2,000 years of forceful tradition against it. And if you have a church that is only capable of holding to tradition because a few Nigerian bishops might start cutting up rough, it's not going to be a very vigorous voice of conscience to the nation, is it, Calvin?
No, it doesn't look that way. Unfortunately, it does not look that way at all. I think that's all we have time for today. David Starkey, thank you very much once again. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Lots of you have been getting in touch with your thoughts. On Lady Hussey apologising to Ngozi Fulani, Sue says, please ask all your viewers to send Lady Hussey a Christmas card. I've sent mine and so have many others. That's a lovely idea, Sue. I think that's fantastic because one party was forced to apologise to the other, and that's not fair. Trevor says, I'm sorry, but I have no time for the RMT strikers or NHS staff on strike. They're holding the country to ransom. I work in the private sector and for the last 2 years only received a 1.5% pay rise. If I went on strike, I would be sacked. As it should be, Trevor. I think you're absolutely right there. Perhaps some of the public sector should be fired. We should put it in law so that if you strike, get rid of you, get some new people in. That's my view. On my interview with Winston Marshall, Jenny goes to say, what a delightful and articulate guest talking on faith in the music industry. He is a wonderful man, a pure heart, a very good fellow. It was a privilege to have him on. The Cambridge Dictionary now has been changed. The definition of the word woman has been, well, there's been a new definition added. So we already have an adult human female. We now have the additional definition of an adult who identifies as female. The dictionary's editors have said the new definition is something that people learning English should be aware of. Should they? Should people learning English be aware of false definitions? With me right now is Lord Daniel Moylan in the studio. Thank you for joining me this Sunday.
Calvin?
Well, I'd like to start with actually what we just watched before we get to the nonsense of the dictionary going all woke, because, of course, you sit in the House of Lords.
I do.
And we saw Professor David Starkey telling us that we should not abolish the House of Lords for some very good reasons. What's your take on it?
Well, I won't go down the learned paths he went down. I'll just talk about the practicalities. The House of Lords has a job, and the job is scrutinising legislation, often in great depth, and making changes to it. And actually, many of those changes are proposed by the government in the course of debate because they find it's full of mistakes, what they've written in the first place, even though it's often been through the Commons. And the House of Commons doesn't have anything like enough time to do that job, but in the House of Lords, that's mainly what we do, and it's a very valuable role. Now, there's a lot to be said for having an elected upper chamber. I completely understand that, if that's what you want. But that isn't what Gordon Brown seems to be proposing. He seems to be proposing an elected upper chamber, which is going to be a sort of assembly of the regions, talking about devolution the whole time. So my first question is, who's actually going to do the work that the House of Lords does? The second is the cost. The truth is that the cost of running Parliament, only a fifth of it goes on the House of Lords. 80% goes on running the House of Commons. And that's partly because members of the House of Lords don't get any staff, they don't have any secretaries, they don't get offices of their own. Everyone, you share an office. I share quite a small office with 4 other members of the House of Lords. Right. And all you really get is an iPad and a computer on your desk if you ask for one. That's it. Now, if you had elected members in the House of Lords, of course, they'd all expect to have their own staff. They'd expect to have secretaries, researchers, and people like that, people to help them with their constituency correspondence, and a proper suite of officers. So I don't know where they're going to go, but the cost would be very much higher. And I'll just say one other thing. People say the House of Lords is too large. And it is quite large, but if there are 800 peers, and it's roughly 800 members of the House of Lords, you need about 800 in order to get 400 doing the work, if you see what I mean. Because a lot of people do the work full-time. I do it pretty well full-time at the moment. But others later, they have other roles and responsibilities, or they start to become a little bit feeble, or they only want to do so-and-so. It's actually very good to have people in there, many of them presidents of royal colleges, who come in and talk about the things they're expert on, like it might be nursing or veterinary science or whatever, but don't get involved too much in other things. So in order to get the sort of numbers you need, you probably need a larger number. Otherwise, you need to have people full-time.
It's one of the rare areas that we disagree. I think we should halve that number, but then I'd go back to a hereditary peer system.
But if you halve the number, you'd need to make them full-time. And if you made them full-time, you'd have to pay them salary.
Let's move on to the woke issue of Cambridge changing their dictionary definition of the word woman. We already have the definition of an adult human female, which is what a woman is, but they've added that it's also someone who identifies as a woman. Now, is that not cyclical?
Well, the problem we've got here is this is a very small manifestation of a broad, widespread attempt by a small number of people to impose their view on the masses and to do so by capturing the top layers of society, by capturing the civil service, by capturing the universities, and now by capturing the dictionaries. Now, let's be honest, the Cambridge Dictionary is not a very serious dictionary. If this was the Oxford English Dictionary, that would be a lot more serious, but I don't imagine that, it will be very long before that happens as well. What they're trying to do is to say that what the great mass of people have always believed a woman is, which is an adult human female, but that's not correct anymore. That's just part of the definition. And the truth is, because everyone has a gender which they choose for themselves and they can be fluid in their gender, then anyone what's that mean exactly? That anyone who says they're a woman must be counted as a woman. And indeed, they're going so far in Scotland, under the SNP Green government there, to legislate for that, very, very dangerously. And to give men who identify themselves as women, to give them the legal rights of women, including, of course, accommodation in women's prisons and so forth, and things like that. So, effectively, it is the abolition of the definition of women as we have known it.
But what I worry about, Lord Moylan, isn't necessarily the legal rights of people who identify as women. It's the legal rights of people who don't recognise people who identify as women. The idea that you could have a different opinion to what is in this dictionary.
Well, you wouldn't have, no, that wouldn't be allowed at all. You wouldn't have any rights at all in Scotland if this legislation passed. Why would you expect to have any rights to believe that?
Absolutely awful, terrible. But thank you for your analysis. That was the Conservative peer, Lord Daniel Moylan. Now, you know I like to end the show with a prayer, and this is the fourth Sunday in Advent, so here is today's collect. O Lord, raise up, we pray thee, thy power, and come among us, and with great might succour us, that whereas through our sins and wickedness we are sore let and hindered in running the race that is set before us, thy bountiful grace and mercy may speedily help and deliver us, through the satisfaction of thy Son, our Lord, to whom with thee and the Holy Ghost be honour and glory, world without end. Amen. O Adonai, enjoy your Advent. We will see you at Christmas. We have a Christmas special on at 2 p.m. on Christmas Day, at 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, and up next is Nana Okoye. You have been watching my Common Sense Crusade. Deus Vult. God bless.
Let's look ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK will be wet and windy in many places as increasingly mild air spreads north. Here are the details. Heavy rain will continue in southwest England this evening with blustery winds. A yellow rain warning is in force as there may be some localised flooding. The rain warning also extends across to Sussex, where heavy rain and strong winds are expected to continue. It'll be a very mild evening compared to recently as temperatures climb into double figures. Staying wet and windy across Wales tonight with gusts of 40 miles per hour around the coast. There'll be some heavy bursts of rain at times, particularly in the south. Temperatures will climb across the Midlands this evening with spells of rain at times. It'll be a windy end to the day too. There's a risk of icy roads across parts of northern England this evening, but temperatures will start to climb through the night, allowing the ice to melt away. It'll stay cloudy and windy with spells of rain at times. Snow will clear to the north of Scotland this evening, followed by spells of rain and strong winds. Any snow on the ground will start to melt as milder air pushes in. It'll be cloudy, windy and mild across Northern Ireland this evening. There could be a few spells of rain at times too. So, mild air will sweep northwards across the country tonight, pushing away the cold and frosty weather that we've experienced in the last 2 weeks. That's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. B, I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all,